You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Eric Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Eric. All right, welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I'm down here in Georgia at Crooked Creek Baptist Church, and I'm with the Schrock family. You guys are on your way to the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. Introduce yourselves, tell us about your family, and a little bit about where you're heading, and let's get into it. I want to learn a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. I'm Matthew Schrock, and I'm here with my wife, Susanna, and we have a little baby girl named Selah. Selah, like in the Psalms. Yes. And she's 15 months old right now, and we're expecting another one in December.
We've had a great week down here, and you shared your testimony last night, and let's just share with our listeners a little bit, share your background, where you grew up, how did you when did you sense the call in the missions? How did you choose Côte d'Ivoire? Then your wife, of course, can share a little bit about her upbringing, and which is a lot different than your upbringing. So
Right. Sure. So I have a little bit different background than maybe the average American because my parents grew up in the old order Amish community, and they were raised, in Northeast Missouri, in a community where they weren't allowed to have cars or electricity or anything like that, and drove horses and buggies. And they came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ because of one of their van drivers started witnessing to them. And that started them asking questions and eventually led them to get saved, accept Christ as their Savior. And they started having Bible studies with several other families around that time. And they had a tape recorder, a cassette tape player, and they would put tapes in there and listen to preachers. And they weren't allowed to do that in the Amish community, so eventually they got caught. And when the Amish people found them doing that, they said either you change your beliefs or you're going to get excommunicated. And so my parents, of course, couldn't go back on what they'd learned in the scriptures, and they weren't looking to leave the Amish, but the Amish kicked them out because of their beliefs. And eventually, soon after that, they found a Baptist church because that was what they saw that lined up the closest with what they saw in the Bible, and started going to a Baptist church. And anyway, I came along a few years after that. I didn't have to go through that whole ordeal, but I came along after that and grew up hearing the gospel from a very young age. As you can imagine, because my parents gave up a lot to follow Christ, that was a big deal in our home. Certainly. So heard the gospel, got saved when I was 4 years old, almost 5, accepted Christ as my Savior, and then grew up in going to the First Baptist Church of Wayland, Missouri, under Pastor Dan Dietrich. Okay. And then when I was a teenager, I took a missions trip when I was 14 years old to visit my brother, who was a missionary in Brazil. Yeah. And that was when God really started working in my heart about missions and just clarified to me that he wanted to use me in missions. So I knew that through my teen years, and then I went to college at Ambassador Baptist College, and it took me a couple years to really, I guess I should rephrase that. When I was in my later teen years, I decided I wanted to go into the military. Okay. But I have a great appreciation for our military, but the problem was that wasn't God's will for my life. Right. And God made it very clear to me that wasn't what he wanted me to do. Okay. And eventually led me back to missions, and I realized that God wanted to use me in missions. Right. When I was in my junior year of college, I took a trip to the Ivory Coast, West Africa, where my wife is from. And the purpose of that trip was basically to ask my future father-in-law if I could marry her. And I had wanted to be a missionary in some country in Africa, and I just wasn't sure what country.
Right.
And during our time in the Ivory Coast, that trip,
she's good. She's fine.
During our time in the Ivory Coast on that trip, God made it clear to me that he wanted me to go to the Ivory Coast.
Okay.
And that was where he wanted me. So I surrendered to do that. We were married in 2021.
Okay.
And in 2022, we took a trip to the Ivory Coast with Baptist World Missions Mappers program, and just spent a year there working with Susanna's parents and learned some valuable things. Just was a great time of growth for us spiritually, and just learned the language, learned how to speak French, learned a lot of things there. And God taught us a lot. And we got back from the States in May of 2023, and we just started deputation this summer. So that's kind of an overview of my testimony and my background.
Certainly. So you mentioned, now I'm assuming you met your wife in Bible college.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't just randomly go to Ivory Coast and ask to
Right.
marry a girl there. Very good.
Right.
So she grew up in Côte d'Ivoire. You grew up in Ivory Coast. Tell us a little bit about that. Your parents were missionaries there, I see.
So I was born in the Ivory Coast. I'm the fifth of 12 children.
Wow.
There's 6 boys, 6 girls. And I got saved when I was 5. I grew up hearing the gospel, hearing the Bible preached.
Yeah.
Both of my parents were also missionary kids. My dad, he was born in Nigeria. He grew up in Ghana, and my mom was born and raised in Liberia. So they both grew up in Africa, met in Bible college, and then they came back to Liberia to minister. But during the wars, they had to evacuate, and that's when they saw the need in the Ivory Coast. Mm-hmm. And so that's when they moved their ministry to the Ivory Coast and really focused on just the French ministries there.
Right.
So that's where I was born. When I was 5, my dad was telling the story of Noah and the ark. And we were having evening devotions, and he was just talking about how the world was wicked and God was going to judge the world. And I realized even as a 5-year-old that had I been alive during that time, I would not have been on the ark. I would have been one of those people left out. And so I did not sleep well that night. I think it was about 2 days later, I was still thinking about that. And I was talking with my older brother, and he just explained to me how I could be sure I was going to heaven. And he knew John 3:16. He knew a few verses in Romans. I think I was 5. He was probably only about 9. But he just told me those verses and how I could be sure. And I believed it, and I prayed, and I asked Jesus to save me. And I've not really had any doubt since. It's just been neat how God has answered questions even before I've asked them. Sometimes I would be thinking over, repentance or a term or something, and it seems like God would just send a message that would deal with that issue that I was thinking about. And so it was just neat to see how God was still working on me, and it just confirmed to me, God has a purpose for my life. So I always grew up wanting to be in ministry.
Okay.
My parents always made it out to be the most amazing life. And so it was always a privilege to be on the mission field. And so we were just so happy to be on the mission field. And we felt a bit sorry for all the American kids who couldn't grow up in Africa.
That's awesome.
So we just loved being on the mission field. And it wasn't always easy. Sometimes it's hard to make friends when you're not fluent, you're a little kid and you're not fluent in French, or you're not comfortable speaking with kids who maybe don't, like some of the kids don't speak French very well because they grew up speaking their tribal dialect.
Right.
And so it wasn't always easy making friends, but we loved it. And so I came to the States when I was an older teenager, and that was a bit of an adjustment. I did not enjoy coming to the States for college at all. But I knew that was the next step that God had for me.
Right.
And so my goal was to get an education and get back into ministry as quickly as I could. People would tease me about getting my MRS degree, and that would irritate me so bad. So I was like, no, that's not why I'm coming to the States. But when I was in college, I met Matthew, and my older sister would tease me about him, and I was like, no, we're just friends. And at that time we were. But God God was
Bible
working.
college. You're not just you can't just be friends with the opposite gender.
Well, God
Yeah.
was working.
Awesome.
And so from our friendship, it grew from there. And so we got married, and he at first we didn't want to go to Ivory Coast because that's where I was from.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
was willing to go
Right.
other places. I was like, if God called me somewhere else, I would be okay with that, but it makes sense to go to the Ivory Coast because
Yeah.
that's where I'm from. And he didn't want people saying he was following his wife.
Yeah, I didn't want it to look like, I was just following my wife
That
to
makes
Africa,
sense.
you know. So I struggled with that too.
Yeah.
For
So
time.
I told him, I was like, well, if I'm willing to go other places, you have to be willing to go to the Ivory Coast.
No,
Right.
really, yes.
Yeah.
Of course, and I would imagine that. As you were sharing your testimony, I try to process things and think about different, contingent. What do people think? And
Right.
that's one thing that did cross my mind. I wonder if people perceive that, and for
Right.
you, knowing you're pursuing God's will,
Mhm.
how did you balance that? Of I know I want to follow God's will, but people may perceive it as what it looks like.
Right.
I'm just going where my wife's family is and following where my wife is. How did you deal with that?
Well, I just had to realize that part of surrender is being able to go somewhere regardless of what people think of it. And regardless of if they think you're taking the easy route even, it's just something that I had to realize it really doesn't matter in the long run.
Yeah.
If God wants to use us there, he will. And that's the end, So it was a matter of surrender, really.
I love what you said about growing up in Africa. You felt bad for American kids who didn't get to grow up there. What was, when you first came back to the States, can you remember as a child, what were some things that stood out that were just different? And for example, even my son recently was 6. We came back, and this is probably the trip that he would remember the most. And just it's funny watching him. What amazes him, drinking fountains. He's like, what? And they're always asking, "Can we drink this water? Can we drink this water? Drink this water?" So things like that, which as a first generation missionary, I don't understand some of that. What you're facing, I'm sure you're going to go into missions not knowing what you're facing, and you have the advantage of growing up there. But can you share a little bit of that experience for our listeners? Because a lot of our listeners are members of churches. And what's some of that experience like for coming back to the States and just kind of trying to get oriented? And then as you share some of that experience when you were younger and then even college, were there things that maybe those at Bible college or even members of churches, are there things they can do to help missionary kids adjust and to get used to life in the States?
So coming back to the States, we always were fascinated with escalators and moving floors. Those were always the huge things because we didn't have those there.
Right.
So we were always loving to ride them. And of course, the airport personnel were not too thrilled to have 12 kids trying to ride the escalator. But also just the stores here, there's a lot more available.
Right.
You go to the cereal aisle at Walmart, and there's just so many cereal options. Where we were, there might be 3 or 4 cereal options, and they're expensive. So we got cereal for Christmas. That was a Christmas present. We would all get our box of cereal.
Awesome.
And here though, people, I think they take it for granted, just the options and how cheap the options are. So that was just something that we always looked forward to coming to America as we got cereal. we got options. I forget all of your questions you asked because you asked several.
Yeah, just some of that experience, and you're sharing that with just, as a kid, and even you mentioned, going to Bible college, and what do you think that attachment? Obviously, you grew up in Africa, right? And so a lot of missionary kids I meet, they long for that, but there is that difficulty of transitioning, and there's even some missionary kids who end up staying in the culture they didn't grow up in. They'll stay in the States, and it is a struggle.
Right.
Are there things that maybe members of churches you attend or friends that, maybe you're going to Bible college and you have a friend who's a missionary kid? What's some things maybe we can consciously do to help MKs that are back in the States?
Something that was hard for me was I'm white, but I don't think like an American.
Right.
And so when we're in the States, it seems like everyone expected us to have the same value system, to think like an American.
Right.
And we didn't. You know, we love fruit, we love being outside, we love warm weather, we love humidity, and, you know, there's just different things that your value system is different.
Right.
And so people in the States, they expect you to act like, you know, a normal American teenager or whatever. And it's like, you know, so for Christmas, for example, you know, my aunts and uncles or grandmas, they'd buy you certain toys that were popular during that time, but we had no interest in them. You know, we would rather have art stuff or craft stuff. We didn't care for, you know, the Polly Pockets or whatever it was they were buying. Yeah. And so sometimes it felt hard because your family or your people who should know you, they don't really know you. Right. They assume they know you based on, you know, what, you know, who your age bracket or something like that. And so that could always be a struggle, just people not taking the time to know you, and they just assume they know you based on your culture or what, you know, their culture, really, not your culture. Right. So we always really loved it when our cousins would come visit us in Africa, because they would see, you know, this is who we are. Yes. And so it really helped relationships when our cousins would come visit, and then when we were back in the States, we had a whole lot more in common, just because they understood us and we understood them. And it was just a lot different. Something you said about coming back to the States, we always loved rest areas. Really? Because when we travel in Africa, there are no rest areas. That's true. So you stop and it's the bush, you know, it's the left side of the road or the right side of the road. And you want the bush that's dense. So you wait till you find like dense bush with maybe a little path, and that's where you stop. So when we first came back, we would stop at a rest area, and the younger kids in the family would get out and they'd look around and they'd say, "But where are the trees?" It's like, no, you don't need the trees. There's a bathroom.
When we first came back, my oldest, he was about 4, and we were at a big church, about 1,000-member church, and fortunately the pastor's wife is family in our, you know, distant family. And she looked out the window, and in the middle of the parking lot, she said, "Is that your son?" And we looked outside, and there was a little drainage ditch in the middle of the parking lot, and he was using that as his potty. And we ran out there, and we thought we had prepared our kids now, but we came back, and even just with our youngest son, who's older than he was at that time, we're out at a park in Canada, and I turn around, he's behind the biggest tree, and there he is, using the tree. It's like, we forgot to prep him. And so, just things you don't think of that, we got to prep our kids for that. And so, that's great. So tell us a little bit about, I'd like to hear about the needs in Ivory Coast. I've been to Ivory Coast once. I love the people there. People are very welcoming. Easy to converse with, which is what I love about African culture, is the sense of community, the openness. Tell us a little bit about the need there. But before we get there, I'd like to hear kind of what Ivory Coast, having grown up there, how do people receive you? Do they look at you as being, you are Ivorian, once they find out you understand the culture and you think like them? Or is there always a little bit of, you're one of us, but you're not because you are white? To what extent is that? And is that ever a struggle with, this is my home, but there's still even a barrier of, I'm still a white person in a Ivorian country?
Well, it kind of depends. Like whenever we go back, or I go back, just on breaks in college or whatever, I was always quick to speak French, to the people at security, and they're like, "Oh, you speak French and you have an Ivorian accent." And so I'd be like, "Yeah, I was born in," I'm quick to tell them I was born in San Pedro and whatever. And they're like, "Oh, I've been to San Pedro or whatever." And you just start talking about familiar things. And so usually they're very receptive, and they're like, "Oh, you're Ivorian." And I was like, "Yeah, you're up here." But there are those people, usually it's when it comes to, if you're trying to tell them something, I've seen this in the church. Sometimes you tell somebody something like, "Okay, this is wrong," and they're like, "Oh no, but that's how we do it chez nous, at our place here, this is how we do it, and that's just how you do it." And it's like, no, this is a Bible issue, So sometimes it's usually when it's a Bible issue or a sin issue that they try to split hairs and be like, no, that's just you and this is me.
Right.
But otherwise, they're very friendly and they're all excited that you were born there and raised there, and they like it that we're from there, that I'm from there.
Well, tell us a little bit about the needs there for church planting. Is what is the situation in Ivory Coast, and is it stable? And then do you have open opportunities to share the gospel, and how are people receptive?
Right now, the Ivory Coast is really open to missionaries coming in. Particularly Americans. They love Americans coming in there. And it's very open to missionaries. The people themselves are open to hearing the gospel. And we hope it'll stay that way. We don't know, but we hope it'll stay that way. We pray it will. There are the main religions that you have in the Ivory Coast is animism, which is, spirit worship, worshiping ancestors. Then that's a traditional religion, and then you have Islam, a lot of Muslims there, and they're not the radical Muslims that you might have in some more northern countries, but they're pretty peaceful for the most part there. We do have a lot of Muslims. You also have a huge presence of the charismatic movement, and that encompasses Pentecostals, all sorts of other little name denominations,
We've dealt with a little bit of y'all's charismatic up in Senegal, some. There's been a few traveling through,
Right. Yeah. So, usually like on a Sunday morning, you can hear, you got the CMA doing their casting out demons. You've got the Pentecostals over here, the Foursquare Church over here doing their thing. Yeah. And you can hear them going on. And it's not like, sometimes in the States you have charismatic churches that are pretty wacky on their doctrine, but they might have salvation straight. Sure. What we've seen in the Ivory Coast is that most of the time they're not even preaching salvation. It's a works salvation. And it blends in so well with their animistic culture. It just goes hand in hand with their traditions, because what the charismatic churches are saying is all those rituals, those tribal dances, and all of those things, it's okay. You can bring it into church now. Yep. And just clean it up a little bit. It's okay now.
Put biblical terminology on it.
Right. Yeah. So that's a big problem. So many of the Ivorians are drawn to that, I think, for that reason, just because it goes so well with their culture. So there used to be a lot of independent Baptist missionaries in the Ivory Coast about, 20, 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. But there were a couple of civil wars that put some of them in danger. And most of those missionaries either went to neighboring countries or came back to the States. And just nobody really went back to the Ivory Coast. So right now, there are only a handful of independent Baptist missionaries in the country, and we're seeing that number grow, and that's encouraging. So we're excited about what God's going to do there.
Yeah. Another thing, too, with them being so open to missionaries is they're open to any missionaries. Right. So we have Jehovah's Witness, we have Mormons, we have all these different people coming in, and they're giving their false doctrines, and the people are just as receptive. Yeah. And just the way and there's a large Catholic influence as well. And with the Catholics, they have always just added Catholicism to all the native religions. Right. And so the people have kind of have a history of all the missionaries that come, we can just add. Right. So when you bring the gospel, they think, oh, we're just going to add it. Yeah. And so you have to teach them, no, like you can't add this to your beliefs. You have to choose one or the other. And so that is really hard. They're very receptive and open, but they have a very hard time turning their back on their past religions.
Getting them to see that it's only Jesus. It's only the Bible. Right. You don't have a need for all of your spells and your
curses and your casting.
Right, all your rituals.
So we worked with a guy from Nigeria who he ended up coming to Senegal out of a word of faith. He was saved out of a Muslim background. First church, before he even met a Christian, had a Bible, got saved after reading the Bible. First church he engaged with was a word of faith, extreme charismatic church.
moved to Senegal and didn't have any theological training. And the first church that he joined was a Jehovah's Witness. And I asked him once he came to our church, and we worked with him for several years, and he was very sincere, and that he was very open. That's why he was able to become biblical in his thinking. But I asked, when I found out, how long were you with the Jehovah's Witness? He said, oh, yeah, they almost made me an elder. And I'm like, wait a second, how long were you there? Because he understood now they don't believe in the same Jesus. He said, I was with them 7 years. Whoa. And I said, how could you go 7 years when they teach a wrong Jesus? Like, they're wrong on Jesus. And his statement was very revealing about the way a lot of Africans think about Christianity. He said, well, if anybody claims Jesus, who am I to say that I'm not going to judge them? I'm going to accept them because they claim Jesus. I said, no, it's the opposite. If somebody claims to be a follower of Jesus, you have to put them to the test. Yeah. And the scripture on the test. So what are some of the ways that, that you would initially engage with those who, for church planting, you do your services, maybe hold big meetings. But how do you engage somebody and develop and cultivate to where you can bring them to see that need? Because that would be a big struggle in certain countries like Côte d'Ivoire. Is it a process of time? Do you find, or is it, how do you initially engage those who think they're Christian, but they're not?
Right. Well, again, I have not started a church.
Right. So your wife maybe can answer some of that. What your parents have done, but even in the short time. And I want you to talk in a minute a little bit about the year program you did. I'm very interested in that. But
your question is basically like how.
Yeah, like okay, let's look at it this way. When you go, what are some of the methods of church planting that you'll implement when you go? Sure. You're in an area maybe where are you going to plant a church, and how many are there a lot of churches around? And then how do you plan on engaging those who are unchurched, or maybe they're in a church but they're in the wrong church?
So the region of the country that we're planning on going to is the region of Ma. It's spelled like man, but you leave off the N, so it's Ma. But that area of the country specifically has only one or two independent Baptist churches that I know of. Right. And we visited with that native pastor there and learned a lot from him. But what we've heard from other people in the country is that the people of that part of the country like the things, they love the things of God, but they don't know anything about God. And they're very religious, but they don't know anything about God. Yeah. So the challenge there will probably be just, in a way, helping them relearn what they've already learned about Jesus, if that makes sense. Because some of them have heard stuff from charismatic churches, from Jehovah's Witness, from all these other religions, but it's not the truth. It's not what the Bible says. We have to basically, hopefully, re-educate them on what the Bible actually says about Jesus. Right. So.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
There is also a growing cult that's originating in the Ivory Coast.
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard of this.
Philippe.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we have seen some problems with that, especially amongst the younger guys.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to like his teaching.
Yeah, we've engaged them in Senegal, and they're very militant.
Mm-hmm.
Malik did our lead pastor did an entire series on who is Castle Philippe, because they started a church in our capital.
Okay.
And those guys, man, they are militant, and it is sad. But how he's got such growth, it's insane. But yeah, so that's the in the African. I'm sure you've seen this, and in the African culture, and it's true in a lot of cultures. But a lot of stock is put into the personality, and they're drawn to the personality, into the person, and. Even myself, I'm very careful with how charismatic I am in the way I preach, and try. You can easily attach people to yourself as you're their way to get to God, right? And so that's a hard balance to find.
Right.
It's a very authority-based culture.
Right.
So if you are a person in authority, if you are a leader, if you are, in some high position, your word automatically has clout, regardless of any truth that may be attached to it.
Yeah, and we saw that manifested in some ways. Like while we were there, we'd see, this guy someone in the church would say, well, this prophet came to my gate and he told me I needed to do this.
Yep.
And you say, and you listen to him, like, who was this guy? You know,
Yeah.
who was this guy? Where'd he come from?
Yeah.
And they say, well, I don't know. He's a prophet. And because he was a self-proclaimed prophet,
Yep.
they thought he had authority. And because it's an authority structure culture, they followed it. And that's a problem, getting people to realize, you know, just because some guy said to do this
Exactly.
doesn't mean you should disobey the Bible. You know.
Yeah. No, that's
So-
true. So definitely challenges that are there. But I think part of why the Lord calls white people, Americans, to go to a place like West Africa is that, is it the same in Ivory Coast? I see it some in Senegal. Now, there's a lot of animosity against the French right now, politically. Okay, we're not going to get into that. As
Right.
I have my opinions on that, but there seems to be in some African cultures and countries, automatically you're viewed as having a position of authority. Kind of, you're educated, and so there's a respect level that's already there. Is that kind of similar in Ivory Coast?
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, they, like you said, the education level, that if you came from the United States, they automatically assume that you're well educated,
Right.
and you know how everything's done, you know. And sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not always a good thing,
Certainly.
but sometimes it can be
Right.
a big asset, you know, when you're trying to share the gospel and things.
Very good.
Yeah.
So you spent a year, and we're actually working on structuring a year internship program with
Okay.
our mission with BIMI,
Good.
part of our Sahara Initiative project. We want to get more missionaries in Northern Africa,
Mhm.
and I think there's a lot of benefits to it. Share a little bit about your year that you were there, and then as we close up, I want you to share how, if any pastors are listening, how they can get in touch with you
Sure.
if they would like to have you in and present, because I think there's a lot of advantages, not only to marrying somebody who grew up on the field.
Mhm.
I met, you know how many pastors I've met who they're usually concerned about the wife. Is the wife going to make it? And a lot of times when men leave the field, sometimes blame is usually put on the wife. Now, I don't blame, to me, I blame the man. Somewhere there was a failure in the man,
Right.
in his leadership, and the wife just manifested. So that's a whole nother podcast we did. But my point is, I think there's a lot of advantages to you having spent a year before you raise full support. So speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, it was, you know, a little bit different than a lot of missionaries do, spending this year in the country before we started deputation. But God just opened the doors for us to do this, and we're really glad that we did. We were,
Right.
we were working with Susanna's parents for this year, and we were working in the town of San Pedro, and we were able to be involved in their church plant in the town there, as well as another church plant about 30 minutes away in a village.
Right.
And it was really learned a lot of things just being involved in those ministries.
Right.
And, you know, survey trips are amazing. Survey trips are great. Missions trips, you know, you go for a couple weeks, that's great. But you just don't get to see the things that you do if you spend prolonged period of time there, like a year. And there were things that I had to adjust to. Susanna, of course, growing up there, was used to a lot of the things.
Certainly.
And that actually helped me to get used to some of the things because she was already used to them. But a lot of cultural things that maybe I hadn't thought of before, you know, adjusting to things like food. And while we were there, I had 2 language tutors that helped me learn French, which is the national language there. They have about 60 different tribal languages, but most people speak French.
Right.
So I was working really hard on learning French, and God helped me to do that. By the time we left, I was pretty fluent in French. Could understand most, you know, if someone spoke clearly, I could understand what they're saying, and I could communicate pretty much anything I needed to. But that was a huge benefit of learning, of spending time in the country, was I was able to learn it there.
Right.
And was forced to use it. Because, you know, anytime you go out to get food or anything, you have to speak it.
Right.
It's kind of sink or swim, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it was challenging. I think it was about 3 or 4 months into our time there, I got a bit discouraged because I was struggling to learn the language, and it just, really, I couldn't do much if I couldn't speak French.
Right.
We were also on low sleep because we had a newborn.
Right, we had a...
Certainly. Oh, yeah, so you're dealing
Right.
with that too. Yeah, I realized it.
Yeah, Sela was born at home in the Ivory Coast.
About a month and a half after we got there.
Wow. Okay.
Right.
Right.
Susanna's mom is a midwife, and she delivered
Wow.
Sela there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we had a newborn.
Wow.
Cuts down on your sleep schedule and stuff.
Certainly.
But that went well. And as I started picking up the French, I really enjoyed practicing and just it was really exciting. And then further along in our time there, I got opportunities to preach a lot in French and just a ton of great practice. Also, just enjoyed learning from the locals. I could go talk with these guys in the village and just ask them, you know, how's this part of your life, or how does this work in ministry in the Ivory Coast, or you know, what would be the response to this? And so it was just a lot of experience that we were able to gain there.
Yeah.
We also took I mentioned earlier, we are looking at going to the region of Ma.
Right.
We took a survey trip up there, actually made 2 trips up there, and that was really helpful in determining where we were going to go when we go back into the country. So we learned a lot, and I would definitely recommend spending a long period of time in the country before you go there.
Certainly.
If you can. So yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking your time. And I've enjoyed this conversation and learning about what God is leading you guys to do.
Sure.
If there's a pastor listening out there, you're looking for a missionary to Africa, Ivory Coast, I highly recommend the Schrocks. How would we get in touch with you if we were to contact you to have you in for a meeting?
Sure. Our website is gospelinafrica.com.
Okay.
And all of our contact information and our sending church mission board and all that's on there. So
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much, guys. We will be praying for you, our listeners. I hope you'll be praying for the Schrock family as they raise their support. And we look forward, maybe in the future, I want to come back down to Ivory Coast and definitely will connect with you guys on the field sometime.
yeah, thank you for having us today.
Thank you. Say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.